Hello and welcome. I am Marcia Ishii-Eiteman. I am a senior scientist at Pesticide Action Network, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this town hall about bees and the food system, entitled, What's the Buzz About? A Conversation about Bee Declines, Impacts on Our Food System, and What You Can Do About It. It's sponsored by the Berkeley Food Institute and Pesticide Action Network. And we'd like to give special thanks to our co-sponsors, Beyond Pesticides, Center for Food Safety, and Take Part. Over the next hour or so, we're going to examine what's at stake in our food system and what we can do about it. But before we dive in, let's take stock of how we got to where we are. Over the past 50 years, large-scale, chemical-intensive industrial monocultural production has driven habitat loss, erosion of ecosystem health, contamination of our soil, water, and air, and harms to the health of our children, our farm workers, our farmers, and rural communities across the country. As industrial ag has become larger, more industrialized, and increasingly destructive, we've reached a place where, far from feeding the world, which it never actually was able to do, it has destabilized our food and farming systems, and it has undermined the stability, resilience, and integrity of those food systems. One of the most glaring symptoms of these problems are the large-scale bee die-offs that we have been witnessing across the country. To understand how we got here and the challenges we face in turning this around, we need to look at this dramatic shift in the structure of the pesticide industry over the past 20 years. In the 1990s, pesticide companies began buying up seed companies. Initially, they did this in order to actually literally package pesticides and seeds together and sell them at one time. But then with the advent of genetic engineering as a technology, they were able to embed the genetic traits in the seeds that could guarantee pesticide purchase and use. The successful commercialization of this GE technology then led to the further acquisition of seed companies by these big six pesticide companies, the biggest six pesticide companies, and it marked the start of this dramatic consolidation of the seed sector. Today, 6 corporations dominate the world's pesticide and seed industry, and 3 of those companies control over 1/3 of the world's seed supply. And one of those companies, one of them, Monsanto, controls over 1/4 of the world's seed supply. And during the same period, we have lost, in the US, we have lost over 200 independent seed companies bought up largely by these pesticide companies. So what does all this have to do with bees, you're wondering? A class of pesticides called neonicotinoids were introduced during this wave of products in the 1990s at about the same time. And today, over 80 to 90% of US corn, cotton, and soybean acreage, depending on the crop, is genetically engineered, and virtually all of that GE seed is now pre-treated with neonicotinoid pesticides. So it's now virtually impossible for farmers to find or buy non-GE, non-neonicotinoid treated pesticides in many parts of the country. This corporate consolidation of market share that we've been witnessing translates directly into political power. And it's the multiple ways in which the industry holds sway over our public agencies, our regulatory processes, our research institutions in some cases, and our policy that has become one of the biggest roadblocks to the adoption of bee protective policy and the uptake of diversified, ecologically based farming systems. So that's a big problem we're facing. The solutions we'll have to draw on will need to be creative, diversified, and powerful, and will involve the active engagement by scientists, researchers, beekeepers, farmers, and ordinary individuals across the country. Let's learn more about what's at stake for bees in particular, and as a canary in the agricultural system that we're in, and also what we can do to turn this situation around. So without further ado, I will turn us over to Todd Woody, who is Senior Editor for Environment and Wildlife at Take Part.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you, Todd.
This is my first indication that bees were a big deal came last July when I wrote what I thought was going to be a routine story on a scientific study looking at the impact of pesticides on bees. It attracted more than 2 million readers in a couple of days. Clearly, it struck a nerve. So what I'd like to do is have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right to it.
Ladies first.
Hello, I'm Susan Kegley with Pesticide Research Institute and a consulting scientist for Pesticide Action Network. And I work with commercial beekeepers and also providing resources for consumers and researchers who are interested in knowing more about what contributes to the toxicity of certain pesticides to bees.
I'm Kremen. I'm one of the faculty directors for the Berkeley Food Institute and a professor at University of California, Berkeley. And for about the past 15 years, I've been studying the native pollinators. That's the other 19,999 bee species, plus a bunch of other creatures that pollinate a wide diversity of plants, but including a lot of our crops. And I've been studying the native bee contributions here in California to crop pollination.
I'm Brandi. I am a commercial beekeeper from Los Banos, California. My son and I operate about 2,000 colonies for the production of honey when it rains in California, which we haven't had for the last 3 years. We also pollinate crops. We do a multitude of crops, and we intend to stay in business as long as the bees will stay alive and healthy enough for us to do that.
Okay. Well, why don't we just start with the basics? What role do bees play in our food system? How do they contribute to the food that we eat?
Well, approximately 1/3 of the food we eat is pollinated by bees, and that is directly as a cross-pollinator of various species like almonds, apples, avocados, cherries, melons, down the list. There's over 100 different varieties of food that are grown in California that would not be able to sustain commercially viable yields without bee pollination. In addition to that, bees also pollinate many seed crops. And I myself have some bees and some onion seed right now, which you don't need bees to grow onions, but you need bees to pollinate the seeds so you can plant onions. So any vegetable seeds, alfalfa seed, a lot of different crops rely on bees for pollinating them. So certainly our diet would be very bland without the pollinating activity of bees. So certainly most of the fruits and vegetables that we enjoy would not exist commercially without bee pollination.
Yes, well, it's 1/3 of the food that we eat that bees are providing to us. It's 3/4 of the crops around the world that benefit to some degree. That is, they produce more seeds or bigger fruits or more fruits because of the activity of pollinating bees. So they're really important to us, and they also what matters also is which crops they are. These are the crops that provide a lot of the important micronutrients in our diet, including a lot of the vitamins that we require. So, you know, some people like to say, if we didn't have bees, we might not starve. We'd still be able to eat all of those cereals, you know, that are wind pollinated, but we'd all have scurvy, and that would not be very fun.
I'll just add one thing. Don't forget about the honey.
Last year in a study, USDA scientists wrote that we were one winter away from a pollination crisis just because of the die-off in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about how did we get to this point, a little historical perspective?
When I first started keeping bees back in the 1970s, it was considered to be bad beekeeping practice if a beekeeper lost more than 5 or 10% of their colonies over the winter. I mean, winter losses are something that have happened for years, but they used to be in much smaller percentages than we've been getting in recent years. We've been averaging about 30% winter loss of honeybee colonies every year for the last 8 years, and it certainly is not a sustainable situation. But somehow, some way, the beekeepers that have enough money to restock their colonies and purchase queens for $20 or $21 a piece and get their colonies restocked in the springtime are able to get back in business, so to speak. It's expensive, and it's not a sustainable situation at all.
Susan Kegley here. The one big change that's occurred in the last 10 to 15 years, even 20 years, is that there's some new pesticides that have come online. The neonicotinoid pesticides are one group of them, but there are also some fungicides that are starting to appear to be really problematic for bees. These pesticides are systemic, meaning they're water soluble enough to be taken up through the roots of the plant and distributed throughout the plant and expressed in the pollen and the nectar. So the bees are exposed in their food. There are systemic fungicides, and there are systemic insecticides such as the neonicotinoid insecticides. These chemicals also differ from previous versions of, or at least more recent versions of insecticides or fungicides in that they're persistent. They last for a long time. And you can find very high residues in soils that have been used to grow crops that have been planted with treated seeds. So they last from one season to the next to the next. The neonicotinoid insecticides have received the most attention. They came online in 1994, and with the rise of genetically modified crops that are, as Marcia Ishii-Eiteman noted, the companies that make the seeds have a deal with the companies that make the pesticides, or perhaps they themselves make the pesticides, to coat every single seed that they sell with this toxic cocktail of both insecticide and fungicide. So with the rise of genetically modified crops, we also have seen a rise of the use of these insecticides that's similar to the decline, the rate of those, the increase in use of these pesticides and the rate of decline of the bees is very similar. So it's not, correlation does not equal causation, but it sure should make you look twice.
And more specifically, what do neonics do to affect the bees?
Neonicotinoids are insecticides, so of course they're acutely toxic to bees, and if they get exposed to a high dose, the bees will die immediately. But what we're finding with even very low doses, which is comparable to what the bees would experience by drinking nectar from a plant grown from a treated seed, or pollen from a corn plant that was grown from a treated seed, is that we're seeing effects on reproduction, on ability to navigate. The bees can't find their way back home. There's some really interesting experiments that are being done in Europe on this particular issue. And they also are losing their immune systems. Their immune systems are not as effective. And so the Varroa mite, which is being accused of being one of the primary causes of the bee decline, is certainly a contributor, but a bee with an immune system can fight those diseases off better that the Varroa mite is transmitting than a bee that doesn't have an immune system. So there are a lot of kind of subacute effects that will still kill the bees, but are occurring at very, very low doses of these pesticides.
So there are so many things happening to the bees at once. The honeybees, there's the Varroa mite that Susan just mentioned that came in to this country in 1989 or so. And when that happened, it caused an increase in these die-offs that were happening every year, from a low percentage to a higher percentage. But now with the neonicotinoid pesticides, you have several things going on at once. As Susan mentioned, the depression of the immune system. At the same time, when you have the Varroa mite, which helps to transmit some of these diseases, and there's quite a number of different diseases that affect honeybees. And just to make a related point, when we think about depending on a single pollinator, like the honeybee, we're putting a lot of eggs in one basket. There are other species out there that are also contributing, in fact, contributing quite a lot, as we're learning more and more how important these native pollinators are worldwide. We're finding that they are contributing a great deal to crop pollination. So they provide something of an insurance policy. The native bees definitely are affected by neonicotinoids and other pesticides, but they don't necessarily have all of the same issues. They may have different issues than the honeybee. They may have different diseases, but they don't necessarily share all the same diseases, and they aren't affected by the Varroa mite. So it's good to have diversity in our system. We need honeybees, and we need other pollinators, other native bees, and even other types of pollinators altogether, like flies, to contribute to have really a sustainable pollination system.
So Claire, native bees play an important role, and people have been encouraged to grow bee-friendly gardens. the same time, some seeds are treated with neonics to begin with. So could people unwittingly be planting plants in the garden that would have an impact, or does it have any kind of impact if they're growing from seeds?
Well, certainly if home gardeners, for example, are gardening for native pollinators and they're using neonicotinoids in any form, whether it would be a seed treatment or spraying it outright or using a soil drench or whatever, yeah, that would definitely affect any insects. Can be affected by these neonicotinoids. They affect insects in general.
And if I'm going to Home Depot or Orchard Supply, how do I know what even to buy?
I might turn to Susan on that. There are ingredient lists, but I don't know how transparent it is.
We did a study with Friends of the Earth last year, and the second version of that study is about to be released in another week, where we went to the Home Depots and the Lowe's and the Orchard Supply Hardware and Walmart stores and bought plants that were advertised as bee attractive, bee friendly. And they're certainly on all the lists that you can find on the web of bee attractive plants. And we analyzed them for neonicotinoid pesticides and found that about 50% of them had detectable levels of neonics in them, and some of them were at very high concentrations where if the bee had landed on that plant and drunk the nectar, they would have died. So, but then there's, certainly the ones that had lower levels had enough to cause some of these subacute effects like impaired navigation or immune system dysfunction. So, without giving away the full story on the new report, let's just say that not much has changed. But there's a lot of awareness now, and there's a lot of motion about it. But no, you don't get a list of ingredients on your plants.
So there's no warning label.
There's no warning labels at all. In fact, many of them say, be attractive.
Yeah. I think one of the disturbing things about this University of Maryland study I wrote about last summer was what they discovered, the impact of fungicides on bees, which previously they thought was not a big deal. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because basic fungicides, my understanding was there was no warning that they should not be sprayed when bees were present.
I've had some experience with fungicides being applied around my bees. They, in general, do not affect the adult bees as far as being toxic to adult bees. In other words, there is a risk analysis at the Environmental Protection Agency where products are looked at for their adult bee toxicity, and fungicides fall into the non-toxic group, but that does not mean that they don't affect the colony in some way. And many of them certainly do. And of course, many times these products are applied along with insect growth regulators, which also have no bee warning on their labels because they're non-toxic to adult bees. And that has created some problems in recent years for the survival of the colonies, because if the developing baby bees in the colony don't hatch out properly into a nice healthy young bee, the colony doesn't have a very good chance of survival, because individual worker bees during the season only live about 5 or 6 weeks. So when queen bees are laying 1,500 or 2,000 eggs a day, to increase the population, those bees that are the result of those eggs have to hatch out successfully. And a lot of times fungicides or fungicide insect growth regulator combinations inhibit or prevent the development of normal bees, and oftentimes, as we've seen, these baby bees will be dead in the cell. They will not hatch out. They'll develop almost to full maturity, but then they'll die in the cell. So indeed, there are problems with fungicides that are not toxic to adult bees ostensibly, but they certainly can have an effect on the colony.
I'll add something to that. We analyzed a number of samples for some of the growers who lost some of their hives in almonds this year, and we're not finding very many insecticides, but we're finding a lot of fungicides. And in reading more about this, there's a certain class of fungicides called the azole fungicides that will amplify the toxicity of certain insecticides. And so even though there were relatively low levels of insecticides in the hives, except for the insect growth regulators, by the way, the levels of the fungicides were so high that the toxicity of the insecticides would be amplified up. So, and the symptoms that the beekeepers were seeing, many of the beekeepers that I worked with, were that they were pulling dead brood out, immature brood. So the insect growth regulators prevent the chitin formation, the formation of the outer shell of the bee in the last stages of pupation. So that wasn't able to happen, and so all these dead brood were just being taken out by the worker bees and dropped in front of the hive.
We've got a question via Twitter. Why are systemic pesticides so bad, and how are they different from other pesticides?
Because they get into the pollen and the nectar, and if they're persistent, they stay in the plant the entire season and from one season to the next. That's why they're so different than many of these other pesticides that we've seen in the recent past. The organophosphate insecticides were highly acutely toxic, and they certainly killed their share of bees, but they were gone relatively quickly. They degrade in the environment relatively quickly. The organochlorines that came before them were very persistent, but they weren't water soluble, they weren't systemic. So you've got the worst of the worst with these systemic, persistent pesticides.
Gene, we were talking before the panel began. Statistic you often see is it takes 60% of the nation's hives to pollinate just the almond crop in California. You were telling me you think it's actually closer to 90%. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we got to this point?
Certainly. The USDA National Ag Statistics Service estimates that there are a little over 2.6 million beehive colonies in the U.S., managed beehive colonies. If this figure is true, and I have no reason to believe it's not, if you deduct the 30% winter loss that has been reported to be the average winter loss over the last 8 years, you end up with about 1.8 million colonies that are available in February, which is when almonds bloom. There are currently over 800,000 acres of almonds in the Central Valley of California, and they require roughly 2 colonies per acre. So in excess of 1.6 million colonies are needed out of the 1.8 that are available, which really equates to nearly 90% of the available managed commercial bee colonies in the U.S. are needed for pollinating almonds every February and March in California. And if I could just add one more thing to the fungicide issue that we just discussed previously, the California State Beekeepers, the American Beekeeping Federation, American Honey Producers, and the Almond Board of California are all working very hard to try to establish some enhanced risk assessment so that these products that have no bee warning on the label but can affect the health of bee colonies are labeled to where a pest control advisor would know that, so that before they make a recommendation of whatever product or products that they intend to tank mix together, that they have the knowledge that these products could harm bees. It's going to be a tough road to hoe, and we've been told by the EPA that there will be no label changes before next almond season. So we're trying to establish an educational program where we can get to the pest control advisors and the almond growers prior to next almond season to tell them to avoid tank mixing certain products together. Regardless of the fact there's no bee warning on the label, they can cause problems. And certainly not spraying during the middle of the day when bees are collecting pollen is also a good idea. And many growers are already spraying at night or at least late in the day once after the pollen's collected. So those are all good best management practices that we and the Almond Board are promoting at this time.
So Claire, is there good research on the declines of native bees? Do we have a handle on the severity?
Well, there's not enough research, but certainly we're starting to learn more and more about the declines of native pollinators, and they do suffer from some of the same impacts. I mean, of course, the pesticides are a problem for native pollinators as well. But when we talk about native pollinators, we're really talking about they're very different from the honeybee. Most of our native bees are solitary insects. They don't form colonies. They don't have these large numbers of individuals all together. So they're not subject to some of the same things that the honeybees are, as I mentioned earlier. One of the biggest problems for our native pollinators is really the way that we farm itself. The fact that we have these large monocultures has many consequences for the biodiversity, for the diversity of the bees that we have out there. And one of the main reasons that monoculture is a problem for our native pollinators is because when you have a monoculture, then you kind of lay out this big feast for the pests, and you also don't have a lot of other kinds of habitat that support the natural enemies of the crop pests. So it pretty much creates a situation where growers growing monoculture crops have to use pesticides to control pests. And obviously, the pesticides are going to create problems for the pollinators, both the honeybees and the native pollinators. And then there's another problem with monoculture as well, which is that it provides a lot of floral resources for bees, both honeybees again and the native pollinators, but just for a very short period of time, and it's all one thing. And so if you can imagine, during almond bloom in California, there's just that's 800,000 acres of almonds, that's what's there, that's what's available. But then when those almond crops stop blooming, there really isn't anything else. And so there's just basically nothing to eat for a lot of these pollinators. And so we don't find them very much anymore in these very intensively farmed landscapes. We don't find our native pollinators. And that's where we need them the most. We need them to provide the crop pollination, and they're not there because they're being blasted with pesticides and there's no habitat to provide the floral resources they need or the places that they need to nest. So that's kind of what's happening. There's really a disconnect between what we need in agriculture and that we need these pollinators and what agriculture is providing for them.
Has the decline in native pollinators been as severe as in commercial honeybees?
Well, we don't have that kind of data.
Yeah.
It's a lot more difficult to get your handle on what's happening with native pollinators. So what we know in this country, people have focused mostly on bumblebees, that we have more data. They've been collected for a long time. They're very big and apparent, and so there's more information. So we do know that some of our bumblebee species are declining. Some of them have practically gone extinct in large portion, or have gone extinct in large portions of their range. In Europe, people have done studies, again, looking at bee biodiversity and have found big changes in diversity. But we don't have this kind of, the sort of thing where we know how much of a population is crashing each year. We don't have that kind of information, not that kind of fine-scaled
solitary insects, hard to track.
It's very, very difficult to track that, yeah.
We have another question from Twitter from Richard Allen. We take the honey from bees and give them sugar water in return. Is this part of the problem?
First, the bees have to make honey. And we haven't done much of that in California in the drought in recent years, but we do feed sugar to our bees to keep them alive. It's very much like a livestock person that doesn't have enough pasture for their cattle or their sheep. They have to buy some hay or some other form of feed to keep them alive, and that's what we do with our bees. We don't feed them any more sugar than they need or than we need to feed them to keep them alive, but it is something that we do. We'd like to use, or we've tried high fructose corn syrup in the past. We don't use that anymore. We use a sucrose blend that's been enzymatically inverted to be very similar to the fructose glucose sucrose content of natural nectar, and we find that the bees can survive on that, but we certainly don't feed them any more than they need, and we've been doing this for a long time. We did this back in the 70s when we had 5% winter loss. I really don't think it's a major part of the problem.
So as a beekeeper, if you're trying to minimize your colony's exposure to pesticides, what can you do? I mean, do you have any idea when pesticides are being sprayed?
Yes, in drought years like 2014 and 2013 and 2012, we keep our bees around agricultural crops for a greater proportion of the year than we would in a more normal rainfall situation in California. We have a lot of ranches that we can put our bees on for the times of the year when we're not pollinating crops, and we certainly do that to get them into a clean environment with clean pollen and nectar and a very good diversity of floral sources. But in years like this, when we have to keep our bees near irrigated crops for the majority of the year, we do have a greater chance of having pesticide exposure. Now, when we are near irrigated crops, we register our locations with the agricultural commissioners of the county that we're sitting in, and we're supposed to be notified of any highly or moderately toxic pesticide that's to be applied within 1 mile of our locations. And by and large, the majority of the pesticide applicators are very cognizant of this program, and we get called, and many of them, or the majority of them, especially in the Central Valley in the summertime, will apply the pesticides at night. And if the pest control advisors will recommend a short residual product and it's applied at night, we could get by with minimal or no bee loss. And night applications are very much a blessing for the bee industry. In some instances, the application cannot be done at night, or perhaps a short residual material cannot be used, and in those cases we may have to actually move the bees. But by and large, we just have to put up with whatever is going on out there. But the majority of the pest control advisors and applicators are willing to work with us, and we're very fortunate that that's the case. It didn't always used to be that way, but it's much more so today than it was years ago.
But is that going to help you when it comes to neonics, systemic pesticides that are within the plant and within the pollen?
I'm not
sprayed at night or day.
I'm not aware of any neonics that are short residual.
Right, they're all long residual.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, you need to get rid of the neonics. And then in the second question, if we did say legislation was passed, there is pending legislation, say they banned the use or restricted the use, is that going to solve the bee decline, or is there too many other factors involved?
Well, it would certainly be helpful if neonics were not used on plants that bees could work. You know, our state association and national associations have not jumped on the all neonic bandwagon. Okay, we understand that their use is essential in some areas, but we certainly don't like to see them used on plants that the bees will be working. Knowing the longevity of those products, I think just as in Europe, I mean the sale of neonics was banned last December, right? And I understand that existing stocks could still be used, so they may still be used in some instances until the existing stocks are depleted. But nonetheless, the longevity of these products in soil and woody plant tissues would indicate that they're going to be around for some time, even after the use stops.
I think some studies have shown that even if there's drift, so even if they drift to native plants or other plants that the bees use for food.
That happens.
It seems that one of the things that is predictable about the way our pesticide use has evolved over time is that you use one thing, people find out what's bad about it through the process of actually using it, and then someone comes up with the next thing, and it's the new solution. The organophosphate insecticides were the solution to the longevity of the DDT-type pesticides, but they were highly, highly toxic to workers. The neonics are the latest in the group of insecticides. They're much less toxic to workers, to humans in general. As far as acute toxicity goes, I don't think we know enough yet to know about the chronic toxicity or developmental or reproductive toxicity. But I would like to see us move away from this whack-a-mole approach to controlling pests. It doesn't work over the long haul, and to make that change with our agricultural system is going to be a heavy lift, and we need to start investing in it now. The neonics are the antithesis of IPM, integrated pest management, because they're controlling pests that don't exist when they're used. So it seems to me that a big investment on the part of the country should be in changing our farming systems, and that will take some time and some investment.
In some ways, is our monoculture the root of all these problems? You have monoculture requires pesticide use. It eliminates native habitat. It creates its entire food system.
I think it's a huge part of the problem, but it's what has made our agriculture so efficient. You can use, one big tractor that has a 30-foot span to, spray the plants or to harvest the wheat or whatever. So growing a lot of the same kind of plant in one place has maximized efficiency at the expense of our ecosystems.
I have another question via Twitter. If there are no bees to pollinate crops, do these foods just go away?
Do the foods go away?
Will you not have certain types of
Well, I mean, there's always people looking for different types of solutions. And in the almond, for example, where it's absolutely, you absolutely have to have a pollinator, you're not going to get a crop. They've come up with a new variety called independent, which allows them to have a self-pollinating almond. Now, whether it will be commercially viable, be a success, is another big story, or big question. So we don't know. But yeah, I mean, I don't think, not everything is going to go away. There's certainly a lot of crops that will self-pollinate to some degree, or some varieties will self-pollinate. So I don't think that it's all going to go away. But certainly it would become a lot harder to get the kinds of production that we would want without the pollinators. I mean, we need the pollinators.
I mean, sort of talking about all our eggs in one basket, and if we have 90% of the commercial hives in California just to do the almond crop, if there was some disaster, natural or otherwise, is that a big risk?
I guess it is a big risk. Hadn't really thought about it in that fashion, but certainly it's a big risk to the bees. It's a big risk to the almond growers as well. If something would happen to the bees, certainly it is the most concentrated that the nation's beehives are at any one point during the season. So I guess it is a big risk.
Say 30 years ago, roughly what percentage? I know almond crops have been booming in recent years, but roughly what percentage would it take of the available bees of the hives?
30 years ago, maybe about 50%.
50%?
Yeah, of the nation's bees, yeah.
So I think it's a big risk that we rely just on the honeybee, and that really is driven by, again, by the monoculture system that we have. That's why we need to bring so many honeybees into one place, is because of the almond bloom. If we didn't have the system that we do, we would have a lot more native pollinators around. I mean, already they're providing we estimate about 30% of the pollination needs in California, because we still do have a lot of natural habitat surrounding some crop fields. But if we didn't have this kind of system, then we would have much less risk in the system. So, and there's lots of risks. There's the risk of relying on a single pollinator. There's all the risks to honeybee health that we've been hearing about. There's our farming system and the whole way that we live engenders other kinds of risks, like, we're hearing about the drought. That's probably in part related to climate change. All these things kind of come together and create a more vulnerable system.
I'd like to add that I think this gives me optimism. The idea that if there were a crisis like this, and we're heading towards that, there would be strong motivation for people to work together to solve this problem. And right now, we're heading in that direction. We're not there yet, but farmers don't want their yields to go to zero. And you can tell by the response of the public to this problem that the eaters don't want the food supply to end up being just corn and wheat. So I think there will be a strong impetus to solve this problem. And it may actually even reach into EPA if we're lucky.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about solutions for a bit, both on the personal level as ordinary people, what can we do, and then also then on more on the systemic regulatory level. What needs to be done? What's the first thing that, if you could decide what would be done, what would be the first thing that should be done to help save the bees?
I would start by doing what Jean said, which is let's prohibit use of bee-toxic pesticides on bee-attractive crops. We used neonics, the ramp-up started in 1994. The hives didn't start crashing until 2006. It may be that there is, those are still viable pest management tools. I don't like the idea of that because it doesn't allow you to do IPM. But the farmers feel like they are over a barrel now because many of the other pesticides are gone. They have to rotate through the different chemistries to keep the pests from being resistant. So there are, until we change our farming system, we are somewhat over a barrel. But the first step would be to get them off of bee attractive crops.
If I could just make a quick comment. 2006 is when my friend David Hackenberg from Florida and Pennsylvania finally got the attention of some researchers that there was something wrong with the bees, and that's when the term colony collapse disorder came into vogue. But certainly we had some problems prior to that. Matter of fact, 2004 was a pretty bad year. 2004 was probably nearly as bad for colony losses as 2006 was. So 2006 is kind of used as the benchmark for when this all started, but it really started a few years before that. And just wanted to clarify that. But certainly, as was mentioned previously that by Susan, we need to work on this together. I think this recent situation in the almonds is a good example of the beekeepers and the almond industry working together to try to solve this problem. We've got this issue with products that are affecting bee colonies negatively that don't have any bee warning on them, and we've gone to EPA, and we're working with California Department of Pesticide Regulation, and we're going to work with the pest control advisors of California to try to get this solved so that we don't have a repeat in the 2015 of what we had this year in almonds. We also need to work with EPA to try to develop better labeling, better bee warning language on labels that are actually clear and enforceable. And that's another thing that it's a long road, but we think that we can make some progress there. So we're still trying to do that as well.
Claire?
Well, I'd just like to go back to something that Susan said. I mean, it's a very complex problem, but ultimately we really need to transform the way we do farming. That's sort of the bottom line, I think, to achieve sustainability in pollination, but also in many other aspects. And as long as we're on this pesticide treadmill, we're not going to be able to do that. And that's complex. I mean, it's connected to what how Marcia introduced the topic at the beginning, that a lot of this is probably driven more by profit motives for the corporations that are selling the pesticides and packaging them with the seeds in various ways. Not just neonics, but there's also the Roundup Ready stuff, that allows the seed companies to sell a lot of Roundup, another pesticide and herbicide. So, it's a very, very complex, multi-layered issue of control and politics and money driving a lot of what's actually happening on the land, and isn't necessarily what people actually want. So it's difficult.
Another thought that I think is encouraging, in the San Joaquin Valley of California, our #1 honey plant in the summertime is cotton, believe it or not. However, cotton is a crop that can be sprayed with a lot of pesticides, depending upon the year and depending upon pest pressures. One of the biggest pests of cotton is lygus, and lygus bugs will migrate from alfalfa fields that have been cut over to the cotton and then create a problem for cotton. What has been occurring in recent years is very encouraging, because many of the alfalfa growers will leave strips of unmown hay, especially on the sides of the fields that are near cotton, in order to trap the lygus in the alfalfa so they don't migrate to the cotton, and therefore pesticide use is reduced. And if lygus can be maintained in alfalfa rather than cotton, the pesticides that are not used in cotton not only are beneficial for the bees, but the beneficial insects that control other pests in cotton can be allowed to survive as well. So the worms and aphids and other things that may become problematic if the treadmill once gets started won't become a problem if the treadmill doesn't get started. So that's very encouraging. This is something that's only happened within the last 8 or 10 years, and it's as a beekeeper, I'm very encouraged by that.
So what can consumers, as we used to call them, citizens, do?
Well, they can always vote with their fork and purchase the foods that are being produced in a more sustainable way. Look for not just organic production, but also the growers that are really thinking hard about sustainability, thinking hard about diversifying the landscape, promoting beneficial insects, promoting soil health, and all those kinds of things. So that's one thing that that the ordinary citizen can do. And you can also plant pollinator gardens, but be careful that you're not getting plants that might actually have neonicotinoids. Certainly don't want to use any of those compounds yourself. So there are places that you can look. For example, the Xerces Society has some great resources on what are the common garden products that do contain neonicotinoids. There's all kinds of labels, not labels, but all kinds of brands. So you can look for that information.
At Pesticide Research Institute, we've created a number of tools for consumers. And we have a bee resource center at our website, pesticideresearch.com. And it has information on creating a bee-friendly garden, and also lists of pesticide product names. We think that one of the biggest issues is that gardeners who very much care about bees and natural ecosystems go to the store and they have an aphid problem and they see product that's in a green container and they go, oh, this has to be fine for, the ecosystem. And I was at a friend's house and I picked up a bottle of her insecticide that she had there, and I was like, this has a neonic in it. Are you sure you want to be using this? And she says, oh, I'm horrified. She just, didn't want to be poisoning the bees. So we have decided that one of the ways to get the word out is to, we've created a door hanger that organizations can put their own name on and distribute in their neighborhoods, because people just often don't know. And certainly what we're seeing from some of the work that has been done by Marianne Fraser at Penn State is that the urban areas can be a little oasis for bees as long as the people aren't using these toxic insecticides and fungicides on their plants. So grab one of these on your way out, and if your group is interested in having them made with your name on them so that your Girl Scout troop can distribute them, or your family or whatever, then we can at least get the word out. The other thing that I want to point out is that certain retailers are making progress in this direction. And Whole Foods Market announced an initiative a couple months ago, and we're working with the IPM Institute of North America to help create a tool that Whole Foods will use for its produce growers to evaluate their sustainability. And the bee toxicity is one of the criteria that Whole Foods will be using to evaluate produce as to whether it will get a good, better, or best rating. And if people are using neonics, they will not get the better or best rating on their produce.
So what are some of the brand names of neonics if people want to try to look for that?
Merit, Admire, Gaucho, anything with the names of the active ingredients. And there's many products that just have the name of the active ingredients. Baer's 3-in-1 Advanced, that has a systemic fungicide, a systemic insecticide, and I think 2 fungicides actually.
Hemlock for bees?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot. There's about 700 different products that are on the market that contain the neonics, and of course there's more fungicides as well. But.
Okay. We know the beekeepers are concerned, the scientists are concerned, the researchers. What about the growers? What's your experience with the growers? Are they aware that this has become a critical problem?
The growers are very concerned. Keep hearkening back to the almond industry, but they are the largest user of bees in the world. And they have been very proactive in this current situation as I described, but they've also funded a lot of bee research over the years. They've funded at least $100,000 of bee research for the last 15 to 20 years. And I believe this year it's like over $300,000. And this is for anything from mites, diseases, or there's been pesticide studies done, and we've also got a nonprofit called Project Apis Am. I'm involved with that group, and beekeepers and growers together are funding research projects to find answers to the many issues that we're dealing with. So I would say growers, and not only almond growers, but California State Beekeepers joined the California Specialty Crops Council here a few years ago, and so we deal with growers that grow crops that need bees, and so we're dealing with them on a face-to-face basis, and they've come to our aid in many instances in recent years. So yes, growers are very cognizant and aware of what's going on and doing what they can in many cases to try to better the situation.
Okay.
On that same note, one of the issues that we've noticed in what the EPA Economic Effects Division, their analysis of a new pesticide product or whatever, they don't consider the value of bees in other crops besides the ones that the pesticides are going to be registered for. And what they didn't realize, or they don't realize, is that the bees that are used on melons in Georgia are the ones that were in almonds in February. And then they go to Georgia later. The ones that are used pollinating cranberries in Massachusetts might have been on citrus in Florida before then. So you have to take care of the bees year-round. And that message is just now starting to get into the EPA.
Going back to what individuals can do, since we are in Berkeley, I got to ask, for the more politically minded people, what can they do? Is there legislation pending? Is there regulatory action they can try to influence?
There's obviously the Save America's Pollinators Act in Congress.
Can you explain a little bit what that would do?
It would prohibit or suspend the use of the neonic pesticides until EPA was able to get all of the data and all of the information in. It keeps changing, so I'm not fully up to speed on all of the small changes, but I think probably some of it is habitat as well, improving habitat. In the state of California, the Department of Pesticide Regulation is reevaluating the neonic pesticides because of their potential effects or their effects on pollinators. They are in the middle of that process right now. There will be a public comment period on that soon. And certainly, by your choices, your food choices, the way Claire said, shopping for organic produce, shopping, if you're going to put a bee-friendly garden in, be sure that you're getting organic plants. There's a lot of, or several really nice organic nurseries around in the Bay Area. And I think there's a lot that the Bay Area folks can do for bees.
Okay. Another question from Twitter. What is EPA doing to help bees, and why aren't they doing more? How can we get better bee protective policies?
Gene, you want to talk about that new label?
Well, part of that has to do with risk assessment. And some of us testified in the first CCD hearing back in Washington back in 2007, and we testified that EPA needs to have a better handle on the potential effects of products on not only the adult bees, but the brood, the queens, the drones, the learning behavior, or whatever else might negatively affect the colony. So as a result of that and other efforts, in January of 2011, EPA held what's called a CTAC Pellston conference, where scientists from all over the world, and we actually had one of our beekeeper friends, a good friend of mine, allowed to be as part of this group as well. But they developed a process for better assessing pesticides for all of the, or at least many more of the potential negative effects. That was in January of 2011. Finally, just this last month, that book was published. Things work very slowly at EPA, and apparently from what we are told, the EPA will be using this enhanced risk assessment, looking at other effects other than just adult bee mortality as they are analyzing new pesticide products. That's good. That doesn't do anything for the products that are already on the market that didn't go through the enhanced risk assessment, and the only way that they're going to be checked, as I understand it, is when these products go through a reevaluation, the enhanced risk assessment will be used. So that is something that EPA is doing from our perspective to better help the bees, but it's a slow process, and it's only currently being done on the new products. So it's helpful. It's a good sign that they're moving in the right direction, but they're a very slow moving entity back there, EPA.
The one thing that EPA has done recently, last August, they released a new label for neonic pesticides that are applied to the foliage of plants. It doesn't really affect any of the systemic applications where you do seed treatments or soil drenches or anything like that. But the label basically says do not apply when bees are foraging. And then they ruined it all by saying unless there is a declared emergent, or there's an emergency, and they didn't specify how anyone would decide that there was an emergency, or if some of your IPM thresholds have been exceeded, and so the grower who's checking? Who would be checking that the grower had a plan in place, that they had a threshold, a numeric threshold, that it had been exceeded? So much documentation would be required to make that label implementable, and those labels are now on the new versions of the neonic products. They are being changed actually as we speak because they know that they're not quite right.
Well, we had a couple of meetings with EPA officials this spring, and they readily admitted that they missed the mark with this attempt at improving the bee hazard warning and pesticide labels. So they're going back to the drawing board, and we hope to be involved. We've not been involved yet, but we certainly plan to, and I'm sure we will be, and we hope they listen to us.
I think given the critical role pollinators play in our food supply, is much money being spent from the government on this issue? Much action being taken? Do they get it?
Research?
Research, regulatory action, just a sense of the seriousness of the issue.
If I could, on the research angle, the USDA Agricultural Research Service has 3 bee labs in the U.S., one in Beltsville, Maryland, one in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and one in Tucson. And it wasn't that many years ago that they intended to close all the labs but one, and then CCD happened, and with the newfound situation where people are suddenly caring about bees, and we're glad that this is happening. Wish we weren't going through what we're going through to get the attention, but nonetheless we're glad that there's greater attention on bees. The labs are now fully funded, and there's actually in the new House Appropriations Bill, which has not been fully passed by the House yet, there is there's a chance we'll get increased appropriations for bee research for the next year. So that's good. That's something that the government is doing from a research perspective.
So 52 years ago today, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was first published in the New Yorker. And it opened, as you might remember, with a fable for tomorrow, where a planet just drenched in pesticides had silenced the birds, the bees, all types of animals. I think a lot of people think that problem was solved. DDT was banned, other pesticides were banned. Are we still in a situation somewhat serious as she was writing about 50 years ago as it comes to the bees?
I was at a bee conference last summer, and the word Silent Spring came up over and over again, brought up by the researchers who are looking into these issues and studying the bumblebees and the orchard mason bees and the honeybees. And the problem of persistence, these pesticides do persist in the environment. So if you use them one year, they stick around for the next several years. They're not as persistent as DDT, but they're pretty darn close. And that's one of the problems that led to the Silent Spring. And so I think we have a warning flag now, and we should be paying attention to it.
I think it's a big concern. We work on farm fields in California, and we keep track of how many pesticides are sprayed. And on average farm field in our study, it gets 24 different sprays a year. That's an average. So the range is from up to like 90 sprays in 1 year, and that's of different types of things. And so, it's not just neonicotinoids. There are a lot of other compounds that are still being used. And when all these things are being sprayed at once, we don't know what kind of interactions these might be having. So I think that it's it really a concern. A concern for me is, I mean, I really do think that the neonicotinoids are a big part of the problem we're seeing with colony collapse. And it would be great if they could be regulated, if we could adopt the precautionary principle and say we don't want to use these things while there's any concern or possibility that they might be causing these problems in honeybees. But my concern is that's not the end of the story. What are people then going to use to replace the neonicotinoids? So again, I really think that we need to be thinking about a way of changing our farming system from one that is so dependent on releasing all of these toxins into the environment.
I think we're just about out of time, but I say one difference from 52 years ago when Silent Spring was published, she was vilified by the chemical industry and was sort of a voice in the wilderness, but with the bees, it seems there's widespread realization of the issue, and it's more that the chemical companies are on the defensive. Does that give you cause for hope?
Definitely.
Great, great. Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank our panelists. It's very...
Thanks very much. You mentioned that Europe has legislated a ban on neonics. What's their plan?
Yes. It's not exactly a ban. It's a suspension of use on bee attractive crops. So they're still being used on non-bee attractive crops. And that may be an issue because they persist in the soil. They're in the puddles that the bees are drinking out of. It's only 2 years. It takes longer than that for the pesticides to go away. I think they're going to be watching what happens with the bee populations, and Europe is further ahead of the U.S. in terms of requiring more data for doing the risk assessment appropriately. So it will be interesting to see how that turns out. It wasn't evident that there's a super clear plan that Europe has once that 2 years is up.
It almost seems like it's a holding pattern, you know, that it gives them time to figure out what to do next, you know, to gather more information, more data, to decide whether they should have a more permanent ban on some of these, or at least restrictions of use, or whether the chemical companies will influence the situation to prevent that.
Was your question, what are they doing now in place of neonics since the ban? Or what's the eventual plan on
a temporary ban for 2 years? I thought it was no more neonics.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, if they're going to do that, then they must have tried to think ahead and tried to figure out what they're going to do to replace, or hopefully not replace it with another treadmill compound.
Question about native pollinators. I was wondering if there's a way of measuring their decline if you look at the at what's going on with monarchs, because those are also native. They're not, you know, we're not financially tied to them, so they don't have any support really, but their numbers are in huge decline.
Way down, yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah, they've gone way down, and certainly some species are better studied than others, and the monarchs have been well tracked, and they are going way down. And again, a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's been destruction of their overwintering sites, their, you know, where they're from which they start that migration back up north. Definitely pesticides are in effect as well. There's the loss of milkweed in the farm habitats, in part due to very intensive use of Roundup, getting rid of milkweed. So there's a lot of different factors, and I think that in general, when you look at any creature, you look in detail at what's happening to it. If you find declines, there's usually multiple factors.
Can I ask another question? I was wondering if anybody is talking about changing the aesthetic of the green lawn in the suburbs and in the cities, because those are killing the cities, you know, in the suburbs, bees as well. And that same monoculture aesthetic is what the farmers are doing, and it doesn't work. You know, it's not sustainable. You need a lot of chemical in order to keep it green, looking like a golf course.
Plus a lot of water.
And a lot of water. It's completely unsustainable. So to, start all the way back in small areas, like in cities and in suburbs, with banning these products that consumers like me can buy, which is ridiculous because these are products that are regulated. So people like me shouldn't be able to buy them and just spray wherever. But is there anybody talking about that?
I think again, maybe we have to not just think about banning, but think about promoting positive practices, which are, I think, very feasible to do, especially in an urban environment in people's backyards. It's really about teaching or showing people alternatives, and there can be lots of benefits. Like you could have a lower water bill. You might be required to use a lot less water if we continue to have drought, and so you want to develop a drought-resistant lawn. The best way to do that, a drought-resistant yard, the best way to do that would be to get rid of your lawn and start planting a lot of things that are native to this environment, which already tolerate a dry summer because that's how they're adapted. And when you do that, then you'd be planting a lot of shrubs and grasses that do promote pollinators, and what they really need is a sequence of bloom. Again, depending on which kinds of pollinators, some of our butterfly species need grasses, for example, to feed on in the larval stage. So we need a diversity of plants, and the native plants, the native ecosystems that we have, we can mimic those, then we're going to be promoting a lot more diversity in our insects as well.
For instance, East Bay Mud will give you a rebate for ripping out your lawn, 50 cents a square foot.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I just ripped mine out.
Claire, I'm wondering in the research that you've done with creating habitat in the monocultures, have you found that the bees come, is it something where if you build it, they will come in places where the bees are not there anymore, or do you have to introduce bees and then they propagate, or how do you see that? How does it work?
So what we've been doing in the Central Valley of California is encouraging growers to plant native plant hedgerows bordering their fields. And so these are large monoculture fields, and they are often conventional farm fields, so they are using pesticides. But on the borders of these fields, because they're not planting them already, they're willing to plant a native plant hedgerow. And there can be a lot of different reasons for this. Sometimes they might be doing it because these native plantings will also provide habitat for other beneficial insects, not just pollinators, but some of the natural enemies. And so sometimes they are doing it to get an enhancement of pest control. Sometimes they're doing it because they want some habitat that pheasants will come in and they want to hunt the pheasants. Or sometimes they're doing it because it's beautiful. So there's a lot of different reasons. And definitely we've been studying these now for about 8 years, and we found a very large, significant effect on the pollinator communities. So we see many more different species of bees and other pollinators, flies and wasps, in these hedgerows than we did before, and more abundance of the native pollinators as well. And we see this not just on the hedgerow itself, but into the field. But one of the concerns we have are whether the neonicotinoids that are sometimes being used and are more and more being used, do they get taken up by the hedgerows too? That would be an unintended consequence, and we don't know if that's happening or not.
Being married to a beekeeper for 40 years, we've had a lot of bees that have died, and when we have a bee kill, a lot of the times Gene is really busy and he doesn't turn in a report of the loss. Not only Gene, but a lot of other beekeepers are in the same boat. So when we go to EPA and we complain, they don't have these reports of these kills, so if they don't have the report, they don't think there's a problem. Okay? They need to make it easier for these beekeepers to make these reports, but I'm thinking a good thing that we can do as the public is to contact your congressman or write to EPA and complain, and they say the squeaky wheel gets the oil. We just have to scream loud and let them know that this is a serious, serious problem. And the more the public writes to them, they have it documented, and that's what they work on. They work on documentation. They want to see it written. We can complain all we want. We got to let them know. So tell as many people as you can, call EPA, write to EPA, write to your congressman, and just complain and complain. Hopefully we'll get somewhere.
I have a couple questions. My first question is, what, as far as more things that the public can do, do you recommend beekeeping by the public? I mean, I know quite a few people that keep bees in the area here.
Absolutely.
Do you encourage that?
Okay. Of course,
That would be great.
The general bee population is not what it used to be. Pesticides, mites, whatever. I mean, there are not as many feral beehives around as there used to be, and a beehive or two in the backyard. And I always recommend at least two.
Yeah.
If you're going to go into the beekeeping world, get at least two, because if you have one and it dies, then you're down to nothing. You know, so at least if one dies, you still have one. You can split it and buy a queen and all that. So yeah, I do encourage that. And as a general rule, a lot of beekeepers in urban and suburban areas are very vocal and very pro-bee, which we like, and also it's just beneficial for the ecosystem and for home gardens, and it's good to have bees around, because the feral population is just not what it used to be. There used to be a lot more wild honeybees in the entire USA than there is today. So I think it's a great idea.
From a gardener's perspective, I do have bees. I just got them about 3 years ago. It's changed my gardening entirely. It's like, I'm not going to plant that flower. It's not good for the bees. So everything in the yard has to be bee friendly. And, you know, just that one little bit of space at least is more, it's not going to feed my 3 hives, but at least it will give them a start.
Give them a head start.
But if you plant a lot of bee attractive plants in your yard, and you just start observing, you will start seeing all kinds of different things visiting them. And you know, some of our native bees are so tiny. Don't mistake them. They're you know, about the size of a third of my pinky fingernail. They're really, really small. And some are quite large. And so, you know, we have a real diversity, and there's some wonderful resources online that you can go to and look at the diversity of bees and flies and wasps and butterflies that you might find in your own backyard. A lot of resources as well about how to plant gardens that will provide bloom all year long. Here in California, we can do that, and that will really build up the populations. And it'll be of natives, and it'll provide resources for the honeybees too. Whatever honeybees are in the neighborhood, because other people are keeping them, because there's some feral colonies out there. So it's good for everything.
One more question? Okay, I was just going to. The other thing I wanted to, this is actually not a question, it's actually a comment. As far as citizen initiatives, I know there's one circulating around Berkeley right now for banning the neonicotinoid pesticides and plants being sold that have been treated with them. And I know that Eugene, Oregon just passed one. So I'm hoping that perhaps in, you know, with the public outreach that you're doing, that you would also, you know, recommend this to other people in other areas that you talk to.
Absolutely. Thank you for the reminder. But what the city of Eugene did is that they have decided that they will no longer use neonics on the city property. They can't. We couldn't in California, and I am pretty sure the city of Eugene can't force the residents of Eugene to do that. In California, you'd have a problem there because the Department of Pesticide Regulation made sure that in the legislation, enabling legislation for them, that they're the only ones that can regulate pesticide use. And so people, you can decide, municipalities can decide that they will not use neonics, but it's hard to legislate that you can't sell plants treated with neonics. But I think that's a great thing to work for. The city of Berkeley should definitely be next, you know, behind Eugene.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They should have been in front of Eugene.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Just in terms of
individual activism that people can do. I'm a beekeeper in the city, and I asked our local garden center and hardware store, Cole Hardware, if they would possibly consider stopping selling plants that were sprayed with neonics. And they said, yeah. And they developed a Bee Safe campaign, and they've got little stickers with a bee on it for all the plants that are that don't have any neonics in it. So I just really believe that consumers are the real, impetus that are going to change this world, change farming and everything. We just have to do it with our wallets, and we have all the power. That's all.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
To our panelists.